I was recently away for a week of silent retreat, and every evening after dinner I would go sit outside and I would watch the sunset, and I would watch the birds and listen to the crickets and the cicadas. I remember one night sitting there just kind of in awe of the beauty of the sunset and the sound of all these creatures, and thinking to myself, how does anyone experience such beauty and not believe in God? Now, I realize that to the non-believer that can sound like a condescending or overly simplistic argument for the existence of God. We do have to have good reasons for why we believe in God, but I also understand for the believer it's easy to see God in everything. And sometimes when we're pressed as a believer to give an argument for God's existence, it's maybe not always so easy to come up with an argument that's maybe logical for somebody. We want to point to beauty and say, well, isn't it so obvious? So what I'd like to do here is share with you 3 of my favorite arguments. These are logical arguments. I'm not trying to get too much into science here, even though I think science backs all these up as well. I'm not going to go to any scripture on this. This is not about revelation. This is really about logic. How can we think this through? What are good, reasonable arguments for the existence of God? And I'm not going to call these proofs for the existence of God, because a proof gives the impression that it doesn't have any holes in it, or that it's a perfectly neatly contained argument that was going to blow away everyone else's disagreements. But that's really not how we want to approach this. I would say it's best to take the arguments for God's existence and hold them all together. By themselves, every one of them is going to seem insufficient. It's going to seem like it's got some problems, and that's just going to be the case. But if we hold these things together, they work together and they make a strong case. So maybe think of it like a rope. A rope is made up of lots of little strands, right? It's not just one solid strand. It's lots of these little strands kind of woven together. Same thing with the arguments for the existence of God. It's not going to be one thing probably that blows all the other arguments out of the water. We have to hold these things together and say, wow, there's actually lots of evidence when you hold these things together. So here are my top 3 favorite arguments for the existence of God, and I'm going to walk through each one of them. The first is the argument from contingency. The next is the argument for design. And the last is the argument based on our desires. So the first argument is the argument from contingency. Contingency means dependence. So it's not something that's necessary and exists on its own. A contingent being owes its existence to something else. So for example, like you exist because of your parents, and your parents exist because of their parents, and the parents exist because of their parents. It's this chain that goes on and on and on. So it's a chain of dependent beings. Something that doesn't depend on anything else at all for its own existence would be a necessary being. But everything that we see in the physical universe is a contingent being. It is what it is and where it is because of something else. So for example, let me take this chain of paper clips. So we'll look at this bottom paper clip here. This bottom paper clip is where it is because of this one is where it is. And this one is where it is because of this one. And this one is where it is because it's this one. So each one is contingent on the other one. But you can't have an infinite line of contingent beings. So you can't look at the universe and say that this goes on absolutely forever, that there's always contingent beings dependent on something else for its existence. There has to be something else holding it all up, just like this chain of paper clips. These chain of paper clips could not go on to infinity hanging like this. It has to have something else that is not a paper clip holding it up. In this case, my fingers. Same thing with like a barrel of monkeys, right? You have these monkeys all hanging on top of each other. They can't hang on to each other forever, hanging like that. There has to be some monkey holding on to something else. That something else is the necessary thing for that chain to exist. And so we would say then, looking at the universe, looking at all that is, we're full of contingent beings. Always has been. Everything has always been dependent on something else. Even as you look at the theories of evolution, they basically take that argument to the extreme, right? Humanity doesn't exist on its own. It was dependent on some other kind of creature to exist before us, and that depended on some other creature to exist before that. You take it all the way back, you get to this creature, this being that doesn't look like anything we've seen in the universe before, but that apparently, according to those arguments of evolution, is that first being. But where did that get its existence from? It was not the necessary being. There's everything in the physical universe depends on something else. So that's where the argument of contingency goes. It says that there must exist something outside of the world of contingency that is actually necessary in holding up everything else. In other words, there must be a first cause to everything. There must be a creator to everything. And that first cause, that creator, is what we call God. The next argument I want to look at is the argument from design. The argument from design points out that as we look at everything that there is, we see order and we see predictability in some ways. Like, we know what to expect. We can run scientific experiments precisely because there is order in the universe. We see it within our bodies. It's fascinating just to look at the human body and be amazed at the nervous system and the digestive system and all the different systems that our bodies have. It's fascinating that you can look way out into the universe and not be surprised that things like the law of gravity still exists. We're not surprised when we look at the smallest of things and we start looking at electrons and seeing how they move. They move the same way here as they do somewhere else. We see predictability, we see order. And basically the argument from design says if we see order, then it makes sense that there would be a mind on the other side of that creating order. When we look at the order around us, there's really only two options. Either it came from chance or it comes from intelligent design. And I think the hard part with chance is you can't actually prove it. It's hard even scientifically to make the prediction that chaos must have happened, because we don't know what chaos looks like under a microscope. We don't know what chaos looks like beyond a telescope. We can't actually measure it. We can't predict it. If it's truly chaos, if it's truly chance, then it must not obey natural laws. But what does that mean? Does that mean that the chaos that created the universe somehow didn't have laws of gravity attached to it or laws of friction? Does it mean that light behaved in different ways in this time of chaos? I don't think we quite know what that means. Science can't actually predict chance or chaos. In fact, to believe in chance or chaos prior to order must be taken on faith. There's actually no scientific way of showing that there is chance or chaos. And what does that exactly mean? So when we look at order in the universe and we see that there's so much order, the only logical explanation is that something must have ordered it. Some intelligent mind must have made it that way. If you walk into a 6-year-old's bedroom and you see that their bedroom is picked up real nice, all the toys are there in the corner and all the clothes are neatly folded and put away in the drawers and the shoes are neatly side by side sitting on the floor of the closet, you would presume that it was an intelligent being that made it so ordered. You would presume that either the child did their chores like they were told to do, or mom or dad cleaned up the room or something like that. You're not going to presume that a non-intelligent being or some sort of chaos made it this way. It's amazing when you look out at all of creation. You can look way out at far into the universe, or you can look down into the smallest things and watch how the electrons move. Everything has order and everything has a certain predictability to it. We see very clearly that there is order and design. If there is design, then we would say there has to be a mind behind it to design it. And that intelligent mind is what we would call God. The final argument I want to share with you is probably my favorite argument, and it was popularized by C.S. Lewis. It's the argument from desire. The argument from desire basically says this: for every innate human desire that we all have, there must be some real object outside of ourselves that can satisfy that desire. So for example, we might have a desire for food, right? We've got a hunger rumbling in our stomach. That is a universal desire. Every human being experiences that particular thing. Therefore, there must exist something real outside of ourselves to satisfy hunger. And there is. There is such a thing as food. And so it would say that an innate desire is something that every human being experiences no matter what. Now, there's certain things that are not exactly innate desires. Like, not everybody has a desire to drive a Mustang, for example. Some people have the desire. That's a created desire. That's not it's not an innate desire. It came about from looking at an advertisement or something like that, or seeing someone else drive that car. An innate desire is something that every human being is going to experience no matter what. I like how C.S. Lewis puts it. Here's a quote from C.S. Lewis in his book, Mere Christianity. He says this in Book 3, Chapter 10. Creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for these desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. Isn't that an interesting argument? So his point here is we all have this innate desire that cannot be fulfilled in this life. Somehow we're all going to experience that I have a longing for something. I have a longing for happiness. I have a longing for eternity. I have something that cannot be satisfied in this world. And I think if you meet someone who has kind of had it all, right? They've had the nicest houses and the nicest cars, and they've achieved success and all of that. Yeah, there might be a certain satisfaction in this life, but that doesn't mean that they feel completely satisfied with everything in their heart. If someone's really willing to be introspective, they're always going to notice that there's still a desire for more. Somehow our heart has an infinite desire for a happiness or for a love that just can't be fulfilled in this world. And so C.S. Lewis is saying that if we notice within ourselves an infinite desire, and that is experienced by every human being, therefore it's innate, then there must exist something infinite that is outside of ourselves that can satisfy that. To use the Christian cliche, we could say that we all have a God-sized hole in our heart that can only be fulfilled by Him, right? We have a desire that is actually infinite, and there exists a real infinite being that can satisfy that desire in our hearts. So those are my three favorite arguments for the existence of God. The argument from contingency, the argument for design, and the argument from desire. Now I realize that maybe no one of these in particular is terribly satisfying, and maybe none of these are terribly interesting or helpful to you. But I would say if you're in that place of exploring or you're wanting to understand more, be logical about it. Seek out the best arguments that you can find for the existence of God. Because if you're going to disagree, in the end, if you're going to come to the conclusion that God doesn't exist, you owe it to your intellect, you owe it to yourself to disagree with the best arguments there are out there. Not just to pick someone who has some silly argument that's really easy to knock down and say, well, therefore I disagree with God, I don't think that God exists. I think you owe it to yourself to find the best defenders of Christianity, listen to their arguments, and show why their arguments are actually not logical. Then I would also say, even give your chance to pray. Give yourself that opportunity to say, hey, God, I know that I don't know you. I'm not even sure I believe in you. But if you're real, show yourself to me in some way. Help me on this journey of understanding whether or not you're real. I think that that's a really honest prayer. I get that's probably an uncomfortable prayer, but I think we owe it to ourselves. If God is real, and if Christianity is correct in talking about that God, this God is a God of love. He's a God of truth. He's a God who longs to have a relationship with every single human being, and we owe it to ourselves to get to know Him. So I hope that these arguments have been helpful. Feel free to share this with other people that you might find interested in exploring this question of whether or not God exists. God bless you.